What if you really cared about the steep increase in property prices in Tasmania for both buyers and tenants right now? If you cared about that issue, what would you do? Here's a different way to think about it. What if we don't do anything? Have a listen to Saul Eslake.
The share of household wealth owned by people aged 65 and over has risen from 25% to 33% in the past 14 years. That's an astonishing increase in a short period of time. And correspondingly, the share of household wealth owned by people under the age of 45 has declined. And I'm surprised there isn't more anger, frankly, among younger people about the way the housing system has been rigged by the baby boom generation against their children's interests, in effect.
We're going to ask the question, what if you really cared about the steep increase in properties prices around Tasmania right now, the lack of rental properties, the increasing cost of rent? What if you really cared about it? Saul Eslake talked with us this morning. Have a listen.
Absolutely. And they're serious issues. They're more serious issues for Tasmania than they have been in my memory as a professional economist, which I guess is embarrassingly going back more than 40 years. I mean, we're now seeing in Tasmania the sort of conversations about housing affordability, especially for younger people, and about rental affordability, and even about homelessness that have been a feature of life in Sydney and Melbourne for decades, but which we thought here in Tasmania we didn't have to worry about. And now we do.
And so the government will say, yeah, we think this is a problem and we're planning to build, a house a week in Tasmania, or 200, a house a day, close to a house a day for the public housing stock. How close does that go to answering any of the problems? Tasmanian government commitment to building more public housing?
Well, it's part of the answer. And in particular, it's part of the answer to the problem of rental availability and affordability for people at the bottom end of the income distribution, who both generations ago, when home ownership was higher than it is today, and especially today, would never have any realistic expectation that they would one day own their own homes. Public housing, or more broadly social housing that's provided by not-for-profits and community groups, is an important part of the answer for people in that situation, particularly if you're concerned not only about whether you can get into a house as a tenant, but also whether you have any form of security of tenure and aren't at risk of being thrown out of your rental property when the landlord wants to use it for some other purpose. And that may well be legitimate on the part of the landlord, but nonetheless is terribly disruptive for the tenant. So, when the price of anything, whether it's housing or widgets, gets out of control, it's the result of the interaction of supply and demand. And if you want to fix a problem of prices being unaffordably high or rents being unaffordably high, then ideally you need to look at both the supply and the demand sides of the market. So, putting money into social housing that's provided by not-for-profits and community organisations is at least as important a part of the answer as the traditional forms of public housing, but we need both. But I would also say we need to work on the demand side of the equation, that governments at all levels, but particularly the federal government and the state government, do things that, in my view, unnecessarily inflate the demand for housing.
What sort of things, Saul Eslake?
Well, for example, ever more generous first home owner grants on increasingly loose eligibility criteria.
How is that a bad thing? It's interesting that you say that, because supposedly this is a targeted effort to try and help those that are most challenged getting into the market for the first time.
And we have more than 50 years of evidence that shows that those policies don't work. That what they do is inflate the price of housing, often by the amount of the grant. And that's why I've said for years that these things are more accurately called second home vendors grants, or if they're targeted specifically to new builds, which sometimes they are builders and property developers profit margin expansion grants, because that's where the money ends up.
So let's say, what other levers would you be pulling at the moment? Let's pick short stay accommodation. If you do a map of short stay permanent accommodation in Hobart, quite a lot of full homes come up for rent. What if we removed those from short stay and put them back into the long-term rental market?
Well, I think that would have some impact in increasing the supply of rental accommodation for local tenants and reducing rents. Now, research has been done by people at the University of Tasmania in particular, showing that inner Hobart, has a very high proportion of properties that have been shifted from long-term rental to tenants to short-stay accommodation for tourists. And I don't necessarily blame the owners of those properties for doing that. I mean, obviously there's a buck in it, and that's why they are investing in property to maximise the returns to them.
So should the government intervene?
Well, the government and the council, I think, have intervened in various ways. The conclusion I draw is not that this should be banned. I mean, I'm not an advocate of 100% exclusion of people doing these sorts of things for properties. I mean, tourists create employment and bring prosperity to Tasmania as well, and they've got to stay somewhere. We don't have enough hotels to accommodate all of the people who want to come and see Hobart and other parts of our state. But I think there could be tighter regulation than there currently is. And in saying that, I acknowledge that the state government has tightened the regulation of this form of property management, and the councils have done a bit as well. But I think the evidence is that they probably need to do a bit more.
What would you do, if anything, about the popularity amongst interstate investors in Tasmanian property right now? What, if anything?
Well, what I would give some consideration to is not banning them, but imposing higher rates of stamp duty or land tax on non-resident property investors in Tasmania. Now, of course, non-resident investors do pay land tax, which homeowners don't. And there's a separate question about whether we ought to reform our property tax system so that everyone pays some land tax on their home in accordance with its value and use that to replace stamp duty, which is a very bad tax. And I think that kind of reform would actually help improve housing affordability over time. But for as long as we have stamp duties, I would have no problem with, indeed, I would support the idea that mainland investors in Tasmanian property who don't live here, who aren't planning to move here within a defined period of time, should pay a higher rate of stamp duty than locals, in the same way as now Tasmania has joined every other state in imposing a higher rate of stamp duty on property purchases by foreign investors. The point about that is, of course, that the fact that they'd have to pay a higher tax, and especially if it's land tax rather than stamp duty, is something that a mainland investor would then have to take into account in determining what the property was worth to him or her. And it would, standard economic theory and experience suggests, result in mainland investors being willing to pay a bit less than Tasmanian investors would do, or Tasmanian home buyers in particular would do, and would thus do something to, if you like, even up the playing field, bearing in mind, of course, that investors, whether they're Tasmanian or mainland based, do enjoy advantages over would-be first home buyers in competing for property because they get the interest costs subsidised by other taxpayers through negative gearing. And, this is something I've been on for, since 1987 in the case of negative gearing, that I think it should be abolished, and that investors in property should only be able to deduct the interest they pay on their loans against the net rental income which the property generates. And if they want to finance their investment such that they pay more in rent than they pay more in interest than they earn in rent, then they should carry that excess against the capital gains tax that they'd ultimately have to pay when they sell the property.
So to be clear, would you get rid of negative gearing?
Yes, I would.
Yep.
Yeah, I would. And just because people are going to call you in and say that's a socialist proposition. What I point out is that the American version of negative gearing was abolished by the Reagan administration in 1986 when the Republicans held control of the US Senate. The British equivalent of negative gearing was abolished by the Cameron Conservative government in the UK about 5 or 6 years ago. In other words, this is something that right-of-centre governments have been willing to do in other countries, and there's no reason why a coalition government here shouldn't be prepared to do it. Of course, the Labor Party took that policy to the last 2 elections, and they have since gone to water on it, despite the fact that their cousins over in New Zealand have this year gone further than Labor ever proposed in terms of reducing the tax preferences that property investors enjoy. And this is important because the evidence is overwhelming that investors have squeezed would-be first home buyers out of the market.
That was Saul Eslake talking with us about what he would do, what levers he would pull. He says, we have a problem with housing affordability at the moment, and with rental availability. He says it's not just a problem, but a significant one. And you heard his suggestions there.